And now we're very, very fortunate to have Annegret Falkner here, who's all the way over from Princeton, who's also assistant professor at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute. So Annegret's done lots of fascinating work and continues to do lots of fascinating work, understanding social behaviors and social learning and the neural circuitries behind them. And I believe we're going to be hearing a little bit about that right now. So welcome to the stage, and let's welcome Annegret here.
Okay, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to such a really interesting and fascinating meeting. Yeah, I'm going to talk about something a little bit different than the previous people have talked about today. So my lab is really interested in the very broad question of how different kinds of social experiences update our sort of behavioral policies. And my lab, the kind of bread and butter of my lab is actually competitive social interactions, aggression and defeat specifically, but in part because they're intrinsically interesting, but also that we know that the outcomes of these kinds of interactions can have really profound consequences for mental health. So we are really interested in the ways in which these kinds of interactions update kind of what we do next, right, our behavioral policies, even in new contexts, or even the way that we feel. So a lot of projects in my lab kind of take the structure where we're going to track sort of either behavioral or neural variability across these different kinds of social experiences, and then start to make predictions about these kinds of different things. So in the way, oh, there's a screen right here. In the way that, and we can imagine that the kinds of updates that you perform are going to be very different depending on who you are in this kind of social experience. Right? So if this is you, you might think that you're going to do different things or feel a different way than if this is you in this particular social experience. And the way that my lab has gotten some purchase on this kind of question over the years is by really leaning into kind of modern AI-based methods for doing behavioral tracking. So I've been collaborating with Talmo Pereira. He's now at the Salk. He's the developer of Sleep for many years now. And I just wanted to plug one new tracker that's kind of coming down the pipeline for those of you who do animal work, where now we can kind of stitch together 2D behavioral tracking into 3D using the NPOs. And we can create really nice models of how socially behaving animals are kind of moving in space and time. And this has been a big collaborative effort from my team at Princeton and Talmo's team at the Salk. Okay, and in addition to kind of doing this kind of complex quantitative behavior tracking, we do neural recording simultaneously. So we both do kind of what we consider sort of traditional neural recording, single region, high dimensional neural recording. And then more lately, we've been kind of moving into this other space where we can record kind of bulk activity from a bunch of different brain regions, but with cell type specificity. You can think of this as kind of, fMRI, cell type specific fMRI, but in the freely moving animals, and creating sort of computational methods that kind of can stitch these two spatial scales together. Okay, and the reason why we have to take this kind of approach is that kind of these social behaviors are really a distributed process throughout the brain. So I'm just going to highlight you don't need to remember any of these acronyms for the rest of the talk, right? But my lab focuses on the kind of left side of this Venn diagram, the social behavior network. This is this kind of network of areas largely in the hypothalamus and the amygdala. And we think of this as kind of the part of the brain that updates our social behavioral policies, specifically for behaviors that are kind of in the innate behavioral repertoire. And then it's sort of, and work from kind of my lab and others have really kind of figured out that these two brain regions, the VMHVL and the lateral PAG, are really important for updating kind of our internal state to action policy within our social behavior. And in parallel, we're really interested in kind of the right side of this Venn diagram. And superficially, we can kind of think about the role of the right side of this Venn diagram as being the piece of the circuit that kind of updates our behavioral policy through reinforcement. And we've published a handful of papers over the years that really highlight the two specific regions in this network, right? Dopamine release in the ventral striatum, the nucleus accumbens, and its kind of partner in crime, the lateral habenula, as being specifically important for either sort of signaling reward learning and for appetitive rewards and aversive rewards during complex social behavior. So superficially, I'm going to kind of refer to these two pieces of the circuit as kind of the carrot and the stick of the brain for complex social behavior. Okay, but today I'm going to talk a little bit about a third person in this equation, which is this guy, the one who's watching aggression. And in part because we know that watching aggression is really, really adaptive. So it shocked me to learn that humans across the last few years have spent about 2.8 billion hours watching a program like Squid Game, right? Squid Game's very, very violent. And this kind of propensity to watch aggression appears to be really conserved across rodents and even non-human primates. So in fact, we know that primates kind of prefer to watch aggression like 3 times as much as they prefer to watch affiliative social experiences, even if they don't know a single other monkey in this who's participating in the fight. And there's some really beautiful theoretical work about why watching aggression is really adaptive, right? You don't want to have to go fight every single person in your environment to know where you stand in the social hierarchy, right? The observation of aggression is a really good way of kind of shortcutting that process. So we've become really interested in kind of what you learn when you watch aggression. So my grad student who's been working on this for a while now, we call this the sort of what can you learn? Can you learn Kung Fu from watching Kung Fu movies? And so the way that we kind of structure this question is kind of, many people kind of learn a martial art in a gym. It's a very safe context, right? You don't think you're going to go to the hospital when you learn martial art in the gym, but you might think of this as kind of learning by experience, learning by practice. So it's unclear kind of how much all of that learning kind of translates into a new behavioral context, right? These people who learn a martial art might think they can defend themselves better in an alley if they get attacked, but it's not quite clear why. So what if you never went to the gym and you never practiced that martial art, but instead you watch a bunch of Kung Fu movies? Do you learn anything that's useful from this? Nothing? Are you closer to the people who practice or closer to people who do nothing at all, like just watch on the couch? And of course, from this, we've been really inspired from kind of classic work from Albert Bandura, right? This is these classic Bobo doll experiments. If you ever took a Psychology 101 class, perhaps you encountered this, right? So what Albert Bandura did in the 1960s was he had children watch this demonstrator doing violent actions to this doll and then had them interact with the same doll later. And what he found is that children kind of imitate these specific violent actions that they had seen these adults do. And so Albert Bandura, he's not a neuroscientist, he's a psychologist, right? He would often talk about this in the context of sort of disinhibition of aggression. What's happening in these kids is that they're becoming disinhibited. So what we decided to do in the lab was just take this idea incredibly literally. Like, what if there's literal disinhibition happening in this circuit? So, and then we kind of took a step back to think about what's actually happening during observational learning. What does the brain require for observational learning? So you really need 3 things. You need some sort of representation of the actions of others, right? The actions and the internal states of others. We might think about this as a kind of mirror networks. And then including, we also need a representation of the value of those actions. Sometimes we call this vicarious reward. And then the last thing we need is some sort of prediction area that's going to drive reinforcement learning. So this idea of mirror neurons or mirror networks is a pretty old idea, right? So this is a review from some 30-year-old data from Rizzolatti, where he was one of the first people to discover that single neurons, particularly in monkey cortex, kind of had equal responsivity, whether monkeys were doing a specific action or observing a specific action. And it wasn't until this paper came out from Neeraj Shah's lab at Stanford that really made me think about this idea of mirroring actions in a different way. So he found that when animals watch aggression, that there are single neurons in this really specific area that we consider as kind of the core aggression area in our sort of policy updating network. Sort of also responded when animals watch aggression. And so in addition, we started thinking about this vicarious reward signal. So vicarious reward, right, is this property where if you watch another individual getting a reward, you might also get a reward. But when we looked, and we wanted to see whether there were sort of different signals for these kind of carrot and the stick. So when we looked in the literature about, whether there were already whether there were already sort of existing prior literature about vicarious reward, it was actually a little bit thin on the ground. So this is one paper from Matt Roach's lab that suggested that animals, when they, this is rats, when they watch other rats kind of getting rewards, have about a kind of halfway response as opposed to when they actually get the reward themselves. So our questions, going in were sort of, do we see sort of similar signals during complex social behavior that reflect this kind of carrot and the stick? And then do we see similar sort of updating with our signals for vicarious punishment? Okay, so the way that we decided to model this behaviorally is we kind of have this kind of training period where animals can either train by doing, train by experience, or train by watching. So that training by doing are animals that do this kind of classic resident intruder paradigm where they get to basically beat up a submissive mouse every day, 3 times a day for 8 days. So they get a ton of practice. And then the second group is this observation group where they're kind of sitting on this little platform here. It was a little bit of a gladiator platform, and they're kind of watching from above these animals that are fighting. And exactly the same, they're kind of watching this 3 times a day for 8 days. And then our non-group is our equivalent of the animals. They're kind of sitting on the couch. They just kind of run around for the same amount of time. Okay, and then to model this kind of attack in an alley in a new context, right? Now we kind of put the animals through the same sort of rigorous test, where now this is kind of almost a probe test, where we make the fight a little bit harder. So now they're encountering a novel aggressor. This is like a big guy. Now we're on his home territory, so it's not quite clear whether animals can kind of use exactly what they've learned before. Okay, so what we found when we apply some behavioral analysis, so we did some supervised behavioral classification, because there's many, many millions of behavioral frames here. We had to kind of use some new methods to look at this behavior, is that what we found, and then we find that both the observers and the experienced animals kind of either do or watch many hundreds of trials of aggression. So there's no shortage of learning opportunities here. But when we look in this probe test, this hard fight, about whether animals that either learned by doing or learned by observing were more aggressive, it turned out that they weren't. So our new behavioral policy is not just like attack, 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 right? They're doing something a little bit more subtle. And what we found is that basically when we looked in the experience animals, this is sort of predicted by the old aggression literature, so the latency with which they initiate aggression decreases with training. And this was true in the hard fight for both our observation and our experience animals. So it seems that one of the updates that the animals are doing is kind of having a new behavioral strategy. So one of the ways that we kind of get a little bit more specifically at what this behavioral strategy looks like is to take all of these models of behavior that we're building with our neural pose, our behavioral pose, we convert this into a set of behavioral features, and then we can create these low-dimensional behavior embeddings with this, right? And then we do some density and segmentation on this. We use Watershed. Happy to talk about this with anybody. These kinds of tools are becoming quite routine now, I think, in people who do complex behavior. And then we can kind of look in these behavioral clusters and see if they kind of correspond to interpretable behaviors. And it turns out that they do. So some of them look like sort of preparatory behaviors, some look like investigative behaviors, and some look like specific forms of asocial behavior. And then with these clusters, we can also create a sort of transition matrix. So how likely are they to move between these particular behaviors? And what we found is that there's this kind of super cluster of behaviors where animals kind of transition in and out of aggression and these preparatory behaviors with similar frequency. So what we found, what we can do with these behavioral embeddings is kind of project subsets of this behavioral data into these kind of common embeddings and look for differences. And so what you can see is that that there are differences in a couple of key clusters here, but what's interesting is that these observer animals look like an almost halfway point between these animals. And this is true when we kind of look at a cluster by cluster level. So these purple here, which is our learn by observing animals, are basically almost halfway between our learn by experience animals and our non-animals. And what this kind of corresponds to is that when you learn by doing or learn by exposure, learn by observing, you do more of these aggression preparatory clusters, you do sort of less reactive social behaviors and more proactive behaviors, and you spend less time in some of these inattentive behaviors, right? So it does look like there's kind of a similar behavioral strategy. And moreover, we can take all of these metrics of behavior, whether it's the occupancy in any of these behavioral clusters, this transition structure, transition matrix, or even the sort of persistence of this at a cluster level, sort of how long are individuals spending in each particular behavioral cluster. And we can make comparisons between the observer animals and the experience animals and the observer animals and the non-animals. And we can ask kind of whether the observer animals are kind of closer to the experience animals or closer to the non-animals. And in all cases, we find that the sort of behavioral strategy of the observer animals is closer to the experience animals than the non-animals. So it's definitely not doing nothing. They're learning something. Okay, so let's get back to the neuroscience of all this, right? So in addition to doing this behavior, right, we really wanted to develop methods that allow us to kind of look at this circuit in a very distributed way. So my grad student, my postdoc, developed this really nice method for doing kind of large-scale behavioral recording where we can implant these very thin fibers over all of these brain regions simultaneously. And then we can, if you're afraid that this kind of turns the brain into Swiss cheese, I can assure you that it doesn't. We can do nice sort of reconstruction of where these fibers land with light sheet microscopy. And then we can use a tool called fibrophotometry, which is we can record the neural activity of these populations, 2 populations per brain region. And we can, because these animals are fighting, we do a lot of motion correction. And when we put this together, and then, for our purposes, right, to get back to this sort of Albert Bandura disinhibition idea, what we really want to do is record basically excitation and inhibition at every single brain region across this network. And in addition, we're going to record from dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens. Okay, so Now, let's just take a step back and see what we think what these networks are actually doing. So surprise, surprise, when the animals are experiencing aggression, right, there's a lot going on, both in the excitation and inhibition. And when the animals are kind of just sitting there, right, and this is actually yoked behavior from a guy that is performing behavior on another day. So there's not much happening, right? They're just kind of running around the cage, but it's not being driven. And then the sort of million-dollar question is what's happening in these networks when the animals are watching aggression? And it turns out a lot, right? A lot more than we expected, and in both excitation and inhibition, sort of much more than what was predicted by sort of Neeraj Shah's paper. And just sort of to make a long story short, we use sort of a time warping algorithm to look at, to find neural aligned signals to these moments of attack in all of our brain regions. And so when we sort of separate this out by excitation and inhibition, we found that there are sort of attack-aligned signals in the brain of the animal that's actually doing attack almost everywhere we looked. But in the observer animals, it's a little bit more specific, but a lot more than we expected. So, and what we found is that, just like Neeraj's paper, we found activity in this sort of core region of the aggression control network, the VMHVL. But in particular, we found a lot of activity in inhibitory areas that project to the VMHVL. So, okay, this is just one kind of behavior. Presumably, if you're kind of learning some sort of behavioral strategy, you might need to have more of a representation of all behavior outside of just aggression, right? And so the strategy that we took to do this is you can take every single neural signal and project it back into this behavior embedding. And then we can do kind of a map, we can vectorize this representation and then compare whether the maps of the observers or the maps of the experienced animals are more similar. And so you don't need to, this is just to get the gestalt of the data. The sort of take home from this is that when we do these comparisons, we find that inhibitory networks in the observer animals are more like the experienced animals than they are for non. And this is true only for a subset of the excitatory networks. And then in the hard fight, right, so where we're now comparing sort of apples to apples, we see almost the exact same thing. So now the nons are actually doing the behaviors. There's a lot more signal here. We can do the kind of same map-to-map comparison. And what we see is that every sort of brain region has sort of more similarity in the experience group than the non-group, except for this really key area, the lateral habenula, our reversive learning stick, which seems to be wildly different. And so I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, just because we kind of have this linear model. But basically, we can distill the behavior down to a couple of things that are really kind of interpretable from a human perspective. So we think this is kind of indicating a new behavioral strategy where animals spend more time in these aggression preparatory clusters, so sort of be ready to fight. They also learn kind of like don't turn your back on your opponent, right? This is something a very interpretable strategy. And then we also see, I skipped over the model, but we see sort of a reduction in weights from this inhibitory mirror network onto our sort of core aggression region, where we think this is really kind of representing this sort of policy update for these particular sets of behaviors. And I just want to say a couple more things with my 5 minutes. I want to return to this idea of vicarious learning because it's kind of taken over the lab right now. So when we look back at our sort of carrot and the stick in our experience animals and our observer animals aligned to the moment of attack, so the experience animals are basically all dopamine every time they attack. Dopamine, dopamine, dopamine every time they attack, and almost no habenula. And when we look in the observer animals, it's a little bit more of a mix. Sometimes it's dopamine, and sometimes it's habenula. And we think this is driving this big habenula response in the map. And this is true whether we look at by the per animal basis, where there's a lot of individual variability, and even at the per trial basis, where we are where they kind of have this shifting on a trial by trial basis of whether individual attacks are basically appetitive or aversive. And then when we took a step back and started to think about it, right? We were trying to think about like who the observer is actually learning from. When we had designed this task, we assumed that the observer would really be kind of taking the perspective of the aggressor. But more recently, we've been thinking about this as a little bit more potentially as of an inverse reinforcement problem, learning problem, where maybe the observer is actually learning two different reward functions, one from the perspective of the observer, one from the perspective of the submissive animal, the one that's getting attacked, and one from the perspective of the aggressive animal. And then the reason why we see this kind of halfway point in our clusters with the observer is because he's kind of adopting this hybrid policy, right? He's learning basically to attack, but also to avoid attacking. with this context. And then finally, we've been really kind of leaning into building tools that allow us to do some fancier things. We've published some papers that use kind of closed loop behavioral stimulation, both on our carrot and the stick, to kind of devise optimal policies to help them kind of move them into different behavioral states. And lately, we have a new method where we kind of write patterns of activity back into the circuit, and we can kind of, so now we kind of have like read-write capabilities. And on the one hand, we can do something simple with this, right? It's just what this looks like. When we can basically read out the weights of this network at any moment in time and track how these weights are changing as a function of different kinds of learning. And then ultimately, what we really want to do with this kind of technique is really try and can we write in patterns of activity that either look like they've had the patterns of activity of animals who've learned by experience or learned by observation, and kind of create these experiences to sort of pre-bias animals into specific kinds of behavioral states in the future. So I'm going to stop there. I want to thank my lab and my sources of funding, and especially the two people who contributed the most to this work. This is my amazing graduate student, Jorge Urvedo Garcia, and my very talented postdoc, May, who's helped a lot on the sort of technical end. Thank you.
So many, many thanks for a wonderful talk, and I'm sure there are lots of questions. One right here.
It's a really wonderful study. Thanks for giving us. My question is very, very precise in terms of, you have studied functional and basically not necessarily anatomical one. And I'm going to point directly. Is there any change in terms of volumetric or anatomical in nucleus accumbens? I'm going to tell you why. I've been studying suicide, and we found increase of nucleus accumbens in those patients that try to commit suicide using violent means against those that did not try to commit suicide not using violent means. So there is an anatomical volumetric change in nucleus accumbens in humans. I was curious to see if you also found the similar patterns in anatomic of these animals.
Yes, we haven't looked at the anatomy of the accumbens specifically, but are you talking about also the neural responses are different, or? Yeah. We haven't looked at that. So the other half of my lab also works on hormones, and so we've been really interested in the ways in which hormones kind of go back and sort of act as the updating signal in these circuits, right? And hormones kind of famously sort of increase sort of dendritic spines and do all kinds of morphological things to neurons by kind of unfurling these beautiful genetic programs. And so that's exactly the kind of morphological change that we might expect to see when animals kind of use hormones as an updating mechanism. The person raised their hand.
Great talk. Do you have any comments on the age-old question of whether kids should watch violent movies?
So this is, people are dug in so hard on this idea that aggression video games and aggression watching does not create aggression, but the evidence is actually quite convincing the other direction. So I definitely would limit my exposure to violence. This is something we're exploring right now, too, about whether there's sort of a critical period in terms of age of exposure that creates different kinds of change that changes defensive behavior. So I will say, so in psychology, there are a lot of different theories about why people watch horror movies, right? Some of them are all about arousal, and some of them are, so some people apparently watch horror movies because they're, what's called white knucklers. And there's this idea in psychology of sort of threat simulation, where part of what's happening, or for some people, part of what's happening when they watch violence is they're really kind of putting themselves in the perspective of exactly what we show, right? Putting themselves in the perspective of the victim and kind of gaming out what they would do in these different contexts. So I think there's an argument that it's adaptive in some way, but the human data does not necessarily support this.
Hi, I really love the talk. You said you said a sentence towards the end I found really fascinating, where you said something like a switch has happened where the animal goes from perceiving aggression as either appetitive or or aversive, right? So obviously there's any number of neuropsychiatric conditions where this happens, especially bipolar disorder, very episodic, very kind of triggered often by stress, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so I wondered if you have any speculations about, well, A, the individual variation in your animals, and B, like relevance to, I'm thinking not violent aggression, but just what you might call assertiveness, right? Like I think in humans often we're not expressing aggression, right, by beating each other up, yeah.
It's a really great question. I just want to clarify that it's not that there's a switch, but basically animals are kind of simultaneously experiencing this attack as both appetitive and aversive. And we think this is a signature of sort of two different learning rules that there. One that's sort of from the perspective of the aggressor, and then one that's and that they can even switch this on a trial by trial basis. So, but to your second question, we're doing exactly that. So we're also trying to kind of bias animals into being sort of more aversive or more appetitive through different, like if you just got defeated, are you more likely to experience this observation as being aversive to you because you're more likely to take the perspective, right, of the victim rather than the aggressor. Same with a sort of critical period. Are there different critical periods in which you experience this as more appetitive or aversive? So yeah, that's where we're headed with the individual variability right now. But
Great.
yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's thank Annegret again for a fantastic talk.